Today's episode is sponsored by Johnny Appleseed Organic. Did you know that more than 90% of organic fertilizers are made with inedible slaughterhouse viscera like bone meal, feather meal, and blood meal? Keep your garden clean with Climate Guard, the no-kill fertilizer made with ethically derived plant nutrients, humic acid, silica, beneficial bacteria, and helpful fungi. Use discount code TAKE10 to get 10% off your first order at johnnyappleseed.com. That's discount code TAKE, followed by the number 10, at johnnyappleseed.com.
Starting seeds, staking tomatoes, planting a pollinator garden, or transforming your backyard into a private oasis takes hard work, know-how, and a passion for plants. Unlike most of you guys, I'm always looking for trustworthy advice as well as tips and techniques to make my gardens even better. That's why I know you'll love becoming a member of our growing online gardening community called All Access. The folks here at Fine Gardening are always adding new videos, planting plans, regional expertise, and our hugely popular new project guides, which are all for members only, because every gardener wants to become better at the craft they love. Learn more at finegardening.com/all-access. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Let's Argue About Plants, the podcast for people who love plants,
but not always the same ones.
I'm Danielle Sherry. I am the executive editor here at Fine Gardening Magazine.
And I'm Carol Collins. I'm the associate editor.
Yay! And today, being as seasonal as we want to be, well, actually, I'm feeling fallish today. You feeling fallish, Carol? You're wearing orange.
I am. It is. I am not a pumpkin spice person, but it's that time of year.
Neither am I. I had a friend who sent me a meme yesterday that said, I don't care what you say, tacos are way better than pumpkin spice. Fight me. I'm like, no arguments. I won't fight you. I hate pumpkin spice. But what I do love, and the topic of our podcast, which is not today pumpkin spice, it's our favorite ornamental grasses. And I have to say, aside from the ornamental grasses in my garden, I don't have much going on for fall. What about you?
I have a lot of asters and I have annuals this year, which really keep going right up until frost. But the grasses just have something different that I love, even, mixed with shrubs or mixed with those flowers. I just love it.
Yeah, I mean, they do. It's really hard to describe what an ornamental grass brings to the equation. It's one of those plants, though, that when you don't have it in the garden, you're kind of feeling like, something is missing. What is the something? And, it could be a focal point or something like that. But as soon as you throw an ornamental grass in the mix, it just adds that texture and movement and and obviously, that seasonality when you start getting later on in the season. I primarily have shrubs, but one of my favorite shrubs, podcast listeners will know, is Karyopterus, which I do have plenty of, and that does begin to flower, kind of in the last throes of summer and beginning of fall. And so when the Karyopterus and the ornamental grasses meet, it is pure perfection and makes me so, so happy. But it kind of plays off what you're saying with annuals, flowers and grasses go together. Foliage and grasses go together. I mean, is there anything grasses aren't good with?
That's it. They're like jeans. They go with everything.
That's right. That's right. They sure are. So I think grasses sometimes get a bad rap, though, because, I think I've talked about this in the podcast before, but some of my first experiences with grasses were miscanthus. And it was long before I knew any better, that they do have invasive tendencies, some of them, but it's just, they're monsters. They bulk up quickly. In order for them not to flop all over the place, you have to divide them with a chainsaw every couple of years. And I got burned on planting miscanthus early on in my gardening life. And so therefore shied away from a lot of ornamental grasses, but there's a lot of grasses that are well behaved.
Absolutely. And a lot that are native to like a huge part of North America too. So almost anybody can grow them. I think that's one of the cool things about these grasses we're going to be talking about.
Absolutely. So do you have, so start me off with a native grass. Was there a native grass? Obviously you just mentioned it, so it was a good segue.
Yeah. So I've got a favorite, that I had, well, first I read about it in Fine Gardening, and, it's been recommended multiple times. And then I finally got my hands on it, and I've been growing it for a couple of years, Shenandoah switchgrass. And that's a Panicum virgatum. It's hardiness zones 5 to 8, and it's like a nice medium-sized grass, not huge. It gets 3 to 4 feet tall and wide, maybe a little bit taller when it's flowering. It's pretty adaptable. You can put it really likes full sun, but you can put it in partial shade, and especially like the shade of other grasses. Like it's very, it fits with other things, and it takes all kinds of soil types.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's got the thing about this one is I love the foliage. It's got this sort of steely gray ribbon-like foliage, and it's like a nice big mass of it. And in the fall, it turns red. And like all switchgrasses get a little of that, little red, little burgundy here and there. This one really goes red. And I put in the program notes, I put a photo of this in its full splendor. Although this is I must admit, a staff photo from our archives and not my personal switchgrass.
Hey, that's okay. You don't have to say that. Most of the photos are staff photos that I use. I will say, if it looks pitiful and eaten by 8,000 bugs, then it's my photo. If it looks gorgeous, then it's somebody else's photo. This is a cool grass, but don't plant it too close together. The reason I'm embarrassed to take a picture of mine is that I got 5 of them and I packed them kind of close together, and now they're all like splaying out away from each other, like siblings trying to get out of a car after a long car trip. They're just like, get away from me. So next spring, I've got to dig them up and give them a little more space. I love that analogy. That's perfect. I can envision that very clearly. So what does the flower, the plume, the inflorescence look like on this switchgrass?
This one has a tall, strong stem, so it stays up, and then it just like does this fireworks thing at the top where the little seeds that come out, and they're on these slender little, I don't know what you call them, it's like panicles, but lots of air and just this airy like cloud floating over the foliage.
Oh, nice. Okay, so we're not talking like those dense bottle brushes or some of the things that we see on like Pennisetum or something, another grass of that nature. So a little more airy.
Very airy. It looks great with sunshine coming through it. It's, it's just, you don't notice it until you're up close sometimes, but if the sun hits it just right, you see it from across the yard.
Oh, that's so awesome. So what are your plans for that grouping then? Are you going to put the siblings in different rooms so they have a chance to cool down, or what?
Here's what I'm thinking. I think they need to probably be at least 4 feet apart, and right now they're more like 2. So like, I think that might solve the problem, but I do want to have them together in a group because that's the effect I want, is that a big mass of it.
Nice. So maybe transplanting, just kind of popping them out a little bit. Yeah. Okay. I got you.
And I'm thinking that probably spring is the safest time to do it. I don't know. Have you transplanted grasses? Do you know?
I have, and it really depends. For me, it's whether or not it's a cool season or warm season grass. I tend, if it's a cool season grass and it's starting to, show signs of life earlier in the season, I feel more confident in transplanting those or dividing those at that time. But I get a little sketchy with warm season grasses because they don't sometimes show signs of life until so much later on that I don't want to mess with them, especially here in New England, because you get in there, you start dividing and transplanting, and it's not really showing signs of life yet. And I'm convinced, probably wrongly, they're probably a lot tougher than I think, but I'm convinced I'm going to kill them. So I kind of let them mellow until a little bit later on in the season. And generally warm season grasses I'll mess with in the fall, after they've kind of put on most of their show. But a lot of times then you're sacrificing their glory time.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that I'm moving them before we get too cold here and we get a snowstorm in October and then it's game over again. So yeah, warm season grasses I find tricky. I definitely find tricky. So, okay, I'm feeling guilty because you threw in your native grass, and I do have some North American native grass on my list, but I'm going to go with a European native right now. And this is the first grass that truly, no exaggeration, took my breath away, and that's variegated purple moorgrass. So that's Molinia cerulea, subspecies Cerulea variegata. I think it's a rather suspect thing when it's the species, subspecies, the species again. I think you could probably, safe to say that it's Molinia cerulea variegata, but anywho, this is variegated purple moorgrass. It's zones 4 to 9, so it's got a really large range of its hardiness. But this was in a garden out in on the West Coast. It was a garden designed by Sharon Nienhuis. And I was out there in late summer, and this grass is a stunner. It was low to the ground, about 2 feet tall by 2 feet wide. Sometimes apparently it can get a bit bigger, maybe 3 by 3. And the blades of this grass are tricolor. And that's no exaggeration. They are primarily white, primarily then with a yellow stripe, and then you get an itty bitty little line of green through it. So the grass, even when it's not pluming and putting on its, its flower show, is really beautiful. And those blades are very thin too. So, it kind of gives you the Beatles look, that flopsy mopsy head of hair, banging on the drums, Ringo banging on the drum. It's got that look to it, but, obviously squat on the ground. And then in, midsummer to late summer, depending on where you live, it sends out these skyrocket stems that are bright yellow and gets these beautiful purpley, purple is probably a bit much, but more of a burgundy color, little dangly inflorescens on the tips of it. So, these look like fireworks shooting out of the middle of this grass, but those yellow stems are so cool looking and you can see through it. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with Molinia sky racer, which is an exaggerated form, a lot bigger of a similar effect where you get these big, huge, tall plumes of flowers that you can basically see right through. This is a little, dwarf version of that. Just absolutely beautiful. Unfortunately, I saw it there. I fell in love with it. I've seen it multiple times since then, grown to perfection in the Midwest, in the Northwest. Here in the Northeast, it does beautifully as well. However, it needs moist soil conditions and full sun. And I feel like I just don't have the right conditions for that. I tried to push it. I had gotten a couple of them. I tried to push it and put it in my very lean, very dry, very full sun location with not a good watering schedule, and I killed them. But that was completely on me. I think it just needs a more consistent moisture to truly do its thing. So, if I ever decide to put some drip irrigation in or something like that, I think that this is definitely the plant for me. But until then, probably not. I'm just going to have to live vicariously through photos in other people's gardens. But yeah, this is a stunner. So that's variegated purple moorgrass. And if I could grow one grass, this would probably be it for me.
So I have a variegated grass too, and it's really different. And I must admit, it is not technically a grass, it's a sedge.
Oh, that's okay. I've got one of those on my list too.
There is some difference, and I mean, if it looks grassy, I'm going to think of it as a grass. So yes. This is, I practiced the name of this, Irma palm sedge. Irma as in the Wolfgang Irma, who was the landscape designer. And I learned how to pronounce his last name from his obituary in the New York Times, which is beautiful. And I do believe the picture that they show of him might be with this sedge, which was named after him. And it is said it was found in his garden.
Oh my gosh. All right. Now everybody, Okay, we should take a pause in the podcast right now. Everybody go to your phones, unless you're driving, and Google New York Times obituary for Irma and his sedge to see that photo. I'm going to do that on the side while you keep talking. Go ahead, Kara.
So this is a palm sedge, and it's got this really neat form. Most of the sedges are just, little grassy tufts. This has a strong central stem that comes up, and then the leaves are opposite and come off from it, which gives it the look of like a little palm frond. It gets 2 to 3 feet tall and wide. It's hardy from zones 4 to 9. And the straight species is a central North American native. And so you're going to find that in the Midwest, all the way down to sort of the central part of the southern states. I first saw this at Mount Cuba Center, where they are doing a native sedge trial. Mm-hmm. And what's really neat about that trial is that they have a shade structure. They're growing these things in shade. They're also growing them in full sun to see how they perform. This one can take full sun to partial shade. It really won't do as well in deep shade, average to wet soil, so not too dry. And I didn't say the species name. It's Carex muskingumensis. And then Muskingumensis. It's named after a river in Ohio, the Muskingus River, I think. And it's not a prairie grass. This is more like wooded lowlands type grass. But so it sort of fills a different niche than these big ones that we're talking about. But I think still very useful, and I would love to find it.
So is it hard to find? Is it something that you stumbled across it in other nurseries and things like that, or just at Mount Cuba?
I've only seen it at Mount Cuba, and then that photograph of Wolfgang, and I don't know if that's it, but it's a neat looking plant, and the variegation is very very subtle. Okay. It's like just little strips of gold around the edges, and just a nice clean green color, glossy foliage, flowers in the early part of the season, not the late part like these others too.
So you answered my question, because I was going to ask about the flowers and the plumes, because with sedges it tends to be more about the foliage, less about the pluming. And so are they, I think of typical sedge flowers as being, these little insignificant, are they white? Are they brown? Little kind of bottle brushy little things on top of them. Is that kind of what it looks like?
That's kind of what it looks like. Tawny little, like you said, little bottle brushy things. Yeah. Not the main reason you grow it. Kind of cute when it happens, I guess.
Yeah. I'm envisioning this too as something that maybe over time would kind of spread out and naturalize a bit if I put a bunch of them, kind of a lower maintenance ground covery type option if I was, had the right conditions for it.
Yeah, it's a nice lofty ground cover, with some height to it.
Yep. Yeah. Nice. That I am completely unfamiliar with that plant. I'm excited to go and see the photos now of it. I have a sedge too, which is shocking because as most listeners to the podcast know, I have a thing about sedges. I do have sedges in my garden, not a lot of them. And I feel like sometimes, everybody's always like, oh, sedge, it's the best thing since sliced bread. But I feel like a lot of them just look like green, boring grasses. They don't really have that much else going for them. Not your sedge, obviously, and not blue zinger, which is Carex Flakka blue zinger, and that's zones 5 to 9. I love this grass. I think it's absolutely stunning, and I think I came to it because I'm absolute crap at growing Elijah blue fescue, which I love. Blue fescue. I think it's a beautiful looking grass. I feel like it's finicky. I've had a really hard time getting it to look like much of anything beyond a year. Usually it comes back half. It browns out in the center of it. It just doesn't look good to me ever. And I end up ripping it out. So this is my alternative to Elijah Blue. Blue Zinger will take a little bit more shade, Blue Zinger Sedge. It's partial shade to full sun. I've seen it grown in full shade, but you're not going to get its claim to fame, which are these glaucous blue, really, really interesting grayish blades. It does need moist soils, just like most sedges do. But it really is that blue color that's just really, really interesting looking. So it's not a 1-for-1 for the areas that I could plant Elijah Blue and I can plant now the Blue Zinger Sedge, but it gives you that similar color, that similar appearance where it's, kind of a nice textured, smaller in stature grass, 1 to 2 feet tall and wide. Basically it's a sedge that I think speaks for itself in its foliage. It gets those little weird tawny bottle brushy weirdness things in late spring to early summer. Admitted, I cut those off. I don't like them. To me, they're like hosta flowers. They look weird. I don't dig them. I think they're odd looking. I'm going to get letters if somebody's like, oh, that's the best part of a sedge. What are you doing? But I think they're gross. I don't really like the look of them. So much like hosta flowers, I chop them off. And other than that, it's evergreen in milder climates. So if you're in zone 7, 8, and obviously zone 9, this guy is going to stay evergreen for you, which is really awesome. Here in the Northeast, in the, the cooler end of its zone, we're zone 6 here. And then I would assume in zone 5, it does, it holds its own through most of the winter. Not that we could see it underneath the snowbanks, but it does hold its own and then kind of browns out. So I give it the hedgehog treatment that in early spring, I basically just kind of, leave maybe 1 or 2 inches above the ground. And then I just give it a chop. It looks a little awkward and teenagery for a little bit. It's kind of, it's growing in tufts of hair, like, a teenage boy getting his first, beard. But then eventually it pushes past that rather quickly. And then by Mother's Day, by May here, it's looking full and beautiful again. And maybe that's not the right way to treat a sedge. I don't know, but it works for me and it works for Blue Zinger Sedge.
So I have one that is a little different. It's a blue grama grass, blonde ambition, blue grama grass. And this one was like a wish list plant for me. I kept seeing it when I'd be in like Canada and I couldn't go plant shopping because you can't bring them back through customs, right? Or, on the West Coast where I'm like, there's no room in my luggage for you. I'm sorry. But I finally got my hands on a couple of them. And I've been growing them for, I think, 3 years or so, maybe 4. Bouteloua gracilis is the name of this the species. And it's hardy zones 3 to 10. It gets 2.5 feet tall and 1.5 feet wide. So more narrow than it is wide. And I was horrified to learn that this species is also called mosquito grass because apparently it has these like adorable little seed heads and flowers that come off the stem at a right angle. So it looks like a little pennant, right? Well, someone apparently thinks they look like mosquito larvae and they call this mosquito grass. I'm like, how could you?
No, I do not agree. We're not adopting that. Yeah, nope, absolutely not. No. I've never seen a mosquito that looks that cute, let me tell you.
Right? Yeah, this it's just too adorable to be called mosquito grass. It's got this nice clumping habit. So it's like the mound of foliage is nice and low, very fine. And then it really takes a while for it to get going in the spring. And so I always look at it and I think, oh, it's finally happened. It died. It's not going to come back, but it does. And then, sort of midsummer-ish, I would guess, it starts sending up those adorable little flowers that become the seed heads. Fun fact, this is a bunch grass and it's a good host plant for ground beetles, which are fierce hunters of slugs and snails and all kinds of other things that eat our plants. And so
that's
if you
awesome.
plant this, you're maybe going to help to shelter some ground beetles that will be doing pest damage control for you in the middle of the night. So
why didn't they call it slug buster grass instead, like a mosquito grass? Like not only did they give it a terrible pest as its little nickname, but it's an amazing grass for hosting ground beetles that kill bad pests. That's uncool. I'm very upset with whoever that horticulturalist who gave it that name.
Right. The only caveat I would say about this one is I planted it way too far apart to begin with. And so I would recommend sort of getting them closer together, like, a foot and a half apart, because otherwise my display just looked kind of wimpy. But when you get them a little closer together, you get, a little more, it looks a little more full. So that's my only tip from growing it.
I saw this on your list. So, okay, spoiler alert. We do share some of our list ahead of time. I saw this on your list, excuse me, and I decided to hop on the bandwagon with this because, I love blue grama grass as a Western North American native grass. It's a really tough grass too. We've talked about so far, I think for the most part, about grasses that need full sun to partial shade, but moist, well-drained soil. That's a condition not easily found in a normal garden. But, blue grama grass, think the prairie, hot, dry, lean soils, does really, really well without supplemental irrigation. So, off the bat in my garden, and I feel like in a lot of people's, hey, that's a winner. But there's a new cultivar that was developed by Brett Horvath, our friend from Intrinsic Perennials out in the Midwest. And Brett does amazing things with especially grasses, native grasses in particular. And he developed a new cultivar called Honeycomb. And I loved when I had talked to him about this grass and, we were kind of going back and forth. He describes those little flowers as kind of eyelashes off of the stem. And I thought, oh, that's perfect. That's a good description of them. But especially this honeycomb variety, because it has this little golden color down below, which is like the straight species. But then above it, it has like an eyeliner of purple. So you get, a purple eyeliner and a golden lash underneath. And it's just, it gives that little extra something to this grass. Now, I love the straight species. I think it's absolutely beautiful. But this honeycomb, and admittedly, this is a pretty new plant. I think it was released last year to the general public. I haven't grown this grass, but it has all the same attributes of the straight species, 1.5 to 2 feet tall, little less wide, same conditions, and but that little hit of purple in that honey kind of color when the sun comes through it, and you really get that, golden hue with, an accent of eyeliner. It really helps that eyelash just pop. I feel like we've suddenly become a makeup blog here, but it really, really looks cool. So that's, I'm hopping on your blue grama grass bandwagon, and that's honeycomb, which, if not, readily available this past year, will definitely be available this year.
Okay, so I have one more, and it is Standing Ovation Little Bluestem. That's Schizophrenium Scoparium, and it is zones 4 to 9, so like anybody pretty much can grow it. It gets 2 to 4 feet tall and 1.5 to 2 feet wide. So unlike a lot of these grasses that we've been talking about that sort of have like an open or vase-shaped habit, this one is like straight up. It's like this shaggy column, especially when it blooms. A lot of these things, it is... it's like it's got the little foliage and then later followed by the flowers. straight species is native to most of eastern North America, so not, west of the Rockies, although I imagine you could probably grow it if you had the right conditions. Soft green foliage with like a hint of blue, and then in the fall it gets like it turns into this sort of multicolor show. So it gets reds and purples and sort of almost, dark blue almost. The flowers are on these straight long stems, and like when we described a lot of the other flowers as fireworks, this is more like sparklers. Right? It's it starts out purple and then it turns this like frizzy bleachy white, and it'll hold that for
I
the
loved
rest
that
of
80s
the,
reference right there.
winter.
Frizzy, bleachy, white. That's like, what all of us accidentally did to our hair, or on purpose in the 80s.
Right. That's kind of what it reminds me of, damaged hair a little,
better
but
on
in
a plant
but
than
in
on
a
your
fun,
head,
cool
right?
way. I don't know. Right. This is a little different than the straight species in that it will not flop in richer soil. So if you've tried blue stems before and you just like can't do it because they tend to splay open, this one is probably going to perform a little better for you. And it was what I learned in my research was that it was discovered as a naturally occurring whole plant mutation in Landenberg, Pennsylvania. So this was, someone just came across this little guy and said, "Oh wow, you're
that's
different,"
awesome.
and
I
propagated
love the fact
it.
too, because I feel like a lot of people
it.
did get burned on little blue stems in the past, because I know I was one of those people that I did plant them, especially the straight species, I think when it first started becoming popular, and I would always have the splay, and I still have one out in my front yard. Maybe I'll take a picture of it. There you go. And you can see like the example of the bad of what happens with blue stem. But standing ovation, I mean, regardless of wherever you see it, it's this exclamation point. It always looks like a little soldier straight up and down, which is awesome, because nobody likes it when grasses do that weird splay thing, that it could be the prettiest foliage in the world, have the best flowers in the world, but if it's splayed open like an elephant sat on it, nobody wants that. That's not a good look. That's not a good look at all. So Carol, do you have standing ovation in your garden, or is this one that you're pining for?
No, I have this one. I started out with 2 plants, and then I was in an unnamed big box store, and I found something that was labeled as standing ovation miscanthus. And I look at it, and I'm like, that's not a miscanthus, but that's why it's marked down. Nobody's going to buy that if they, So, I got another 3, and now I have 5, but I need to move them into more sun. They're really getting overshadowed in the spot where they are, and so they're not performing their best. So the photo that I put in the notes is one that I saw at Longwood.
Nice.
And hopefully,
just as a reminder to everybody who is listening to this, instead of maybe watching it on YouTube or on finegardening.com, you get our show notes. If you click on the podcast tab, you'll get to see photos of all of these plants, and then you also get plant lists. So, don't be writing and driving at the same time. You're going to get into an accident. Just go to finegardening.com afterwards and hit that podcast tab. For my last plant, it was probably the first grass I ever considered purchasing and then did based on the flowers alone. And that's Mudrie fountain grass. So that's Pennisetum, Acapulcaroides. Alopecaroides. There we go. I always want to call it Acapulco, but Alopecaroides Mudrie, and that's zones 4 to 9. And let's just get straight to it. It is a boring green mounded grass. However, in probably early to midsummer, it puts out these thick bottle brush flowers that are such a dark purple they almost look black. And they persist on the plant all through summer into fall. Eventually the black fades out to this tawny, coloring, but it still persists on the plant. So that's a long time frame for a grass to flower, to look really, really good in flower. 2 to 3 feet tall and wide. I've never seen this much over 2.5 feet tall and wide. It's never gotten that big for me. Maybe that's because it's in lean soil. It appreciates full sun, well drained, lean soil. Like a lot of Pennisetum, it's a tough plant. There's varieties of Pennisetums generally that you will see along with Happy Returns daylilies in the parking lots of unnamed box stores. So, Pennisetum is a tough plant when you see that, but Mudrie is just spectacular, and nobody ever says, hey, grow this ornamental grass for its flowers. I mean, that's very rare that you actually see that. Eventually the foliage, that green kind of nondescript foliage, now don't get me wrong, it's got great texture, so it does add something when not in flower, but that green foliage eventually does change out to a bright goldeny yellow in fall. So you get a little fall color off of a perennial, which is nice. And it's just, it has monstrous pipe cleaners coming out of it almost for 6 months. How could you not love this grass? It is not, I wish that it would. Okay, so this is based purely anecdotally on my experience, but I wish it would seed. But it doesn't, The one thing that it does, which is kind of annoying, is because I'm not good about cutting back my grasses in fall. I generally leave them to their own devices and watch the birds kind of come in and attack all of those plumes. So because they are those thick, monstrous pipe cleaners, usually they hold on until, March, April, when I've got 8 million things to do in the garden. And then they break off and kind of create this, detritus all over the place. So that's kind of annoying. But other than that, no, I haven't seen it self-seed around, which I want it to. I feel like that always happens with the plants that you want them to, they don't. However, I have had self-seeding happen with other Pennisetum before in the past. So, little liner note. In the right conditions, maybe Mudrie does that too, but not for me. Bummer. And now, because everything sounds better with a British accent, here's Peter to talk about his thoughts on grasses and natives.
I have to say that when I first got wind of today's podcast topic, I thought, how strange. After all, I thought that most gardeners turn their noses up at the idea of adding more grass to their landscapes. Yes, I think we can all agree grass has its merits. It provides a place for the eye to rest, and of course it's essential if you have youngsters who like to play outside. And then there's my favourite usage of grass, on the football pitch. But then Danielle kindly informed me that this isn't an episode about turf grasses, but rather about ornamental grasses. Ah, I see. A distinctly different kettle of fish. I regrettably don't have any ornamental grasses in my own garden, although I have seen them grown to perfection in England. If you want to see how ornamental grasses can be truly magical in all seasons, type Sussex Prairie Garden into Google. Their textures, the movement they add to a landscape, and let's not forget the way they glow when backlit by the setting sun. Ah, all things that any garden can benefit from. I'm especially fond of purple moorgrass, a native of the British Isles. Although I don't have the consistently moist soil in my stateside garden to give this particular grass variety what it needs, I'd be better off planting a switchgrass or little bluestem variety, since they prefer dry, lean soils, similar to what you'd find on the Midwestern prairies and in my backyard. Alas, it pains me to say that this English native is better off growing North American grasses. But never fear. I'll put on my wellies, grab my rabbiting spade, and dig some proper holes in the tilth to make the planting experience more English. Now if I can only find my Luton Town scarf. After all, it is a bit frosty out there.
So I love that Peter's come around to planting North American native grasses instead of European natives because, he's been in this country for a while now. He should, right?
Yes, enjoy the local grasses.
Right, exactly. Like he enjoys the locals, like us. So let's see if our expert testimony is a local or a non-local.
Hello, fellow plant lovers and garden enthusiasts. My name is Paul Zammit, and I'm a professor of horticulture at Niagara College in Ontario, Canada. I'm very fortunate to be a part of the horticultural industry for over 30 years, and during this time, I've held positions such as the Director of Horticulture at the Toronto Botanical Garden for 10 years. I also spent almost 20 years in garden center retailing, where I really developed my passion for perennials, including ornamental grasses. I'm a person who loves to learn and to keep busy, and as a result, I am a regular public speaker at garden shows and events across Canada and the US, and even into Europe. I have a weekly gardening show on CBC where I answer live garden questions, and I'm most excited about a new opportunity that we started in 2019, leading garden tours to European destinations to raise awareness about the power and the potential of small and large gardens, as well as raising funds to help support educational opportunities. My home garden is in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and we garden in a zone 5 or 6, depending on where you're located within the city and your proximity to the Great Lakes. Now, our garden is a very intense garden, and both myself and my wife are very passionate plants people. We love to collect plants and we love to collect antiques. And over the years, we've incorporated a number of ornamental grasses in our home garden. I am most excited to share with you my favorite or my top picks of ornamental grasses. The first ornamental grass I would like to highlight is Chesmantium latifolium, northern sea oats or Indian wood oats. This is a North American native, native to the eastern United States. And in terms of its height, it really depends on where you are growing it, because this ornamental grass you can grow in full sun or you can grow it in a partial shaded location. And I find depending on where it's growing, its height will vary. In more shaded locations, I find it tends to get a little bit taller. So the height can vary anywhere from about 2.5 feet to 5 feet, and its spread is about a 2.5 foot spread. It's hardy from zones 3 to 8. And what I really love is the tassels that this ornamental grass produces. It's these dangling tassels, which for us here in Toronto, begin to appear in August and carry through September, October, and have wonderful winter interest. Those of you that are into floral design, these green tassels can be cut in a green stage and they're great in fresh arrangements, or you can also cut them in the dry stage and they're wonderful in dried arrangements. But please keep in mind, be sure not to cut all of them because we want to leave some of those for winter interest, but also we want to use them as an opportunity to invite guests. That's wildlife and birds, because they will feed on the seed heads. And another thing to recognize is that the foliage of this plant, it also supports a number of caterpillar larvae for some different types of butterflies. I really love its winter interest in terms of the soil conditions that you can grow this plant in. It likes kind of a medium to wet soil. Having said that, my garden's very sandy here in Toronto and it still does fine. One word of caution, or just to be aware, this native plant does tend to generously self-seed. So just be aware of that if you're choosing to add that to your garden or where you place it. And it's very easy to recognize the seedlings and to quickly call them out. For those looking for something a little different, I recommend Carex buchananii. Now, this is technically not an ornamental grass. It's a sedge, but it's usually sold with ornamental grasses, and I think it's worth including here. This plant is commonly called the leather leaf sedge, and it's an evergreen, but I want to caution you. When we say evergreen, it holds on to its foliage, but it's far from green. And what I love about it, it's a natural tan or brown color. It comes to us from New Zealand. And in terms of its hardiness, we're looking kind of zone 6 to 9. So even for me here in Toronto, sometimes it doesn't overwinter. But I think it's even worth growing as an annual grass. But again, depending on our snowfall, we get it to come through. In terms of its height, not a very big grass, about 2 to 2.5 feet, with a beautiful arching habit and about a 2-foot spread. I like to grow this plant in full sun, but you can grow it in a partial shade as well. Although the more light you get, the better brown tan coloring you'll get on this plant. And in terms of the soil, I would recommend kind of a medium to wet soil condition is what the literature suggests. But in my own home garden, which again is quite sandy, it seems to be quite happy and content as well. So quite different in terms of its look and its form. And what I really love about this plant is it adds a neat contrast in the garden, but also is amazing in containers, particularly for fall arrangements. If you really want to create that autumnal feel, and combines beautifully with different colors such as oranges and reds and burgundies. So if you're looking for something a little bit different, look out for the world of Caryxes. There are many native selections, many that are tall and of shaded locations, but the one I want to highlight in particular is Caryx buchananii. The next group of ornamental grasses I'd like to draw your attention to are the bluestems. Now these are native grasses, and they're kind of broken up into two groups. There's the little bluestem or the big bluestem. And I want to focus on the big bluestem, or the species Andropogon Gerardii. Again, North American natives, and there's been a lot of breeding work to select out some cultivars. One in particular that has caught my eye and is looking really great is a selection called Blackhawks. Now, this selection is fairly tall, so you want to make sure you position it correctly, and it combines beautifully with things like rudbeckias and late flowering plant material in the border. It can grow anywhere between 4 to 6 feet tall and is fairly narrow in terms of its width. I would say it's in that 2 to 3 feet of width. It grows best in full sun, although some of the literature suggests to grow it in partial shade. I recommend it for full sun for best coloring, because what's really neat about this cultivar is that the stems actually have a wonderful smoky color with hints of red and burgundy, and depending on where it's growing, it seems to change in terms of its color, but really quite different and unusual in terms of the color that it provides. What I love about the blue stems is the motion that they provide in the garden, particularly in the fall. They kind of just dance back and forth. And although they tend to be fairly tall, I find sometimes for us they don't remain standing in the winter, but I'm okay with that. They are very important as a food source for pollinators and seeds. They will sometimes seed the species. We have not seen that yet with the cultivar. And while they're recommended for a wide range of soil types, I particularly find they do best in poorer soils because you get best coloring and more compact growth. If the soil tends to be very rich, they tend to become very floppy. But I highly recommend look out for Andropogon Gerardii Blackhawks. Now, if it came down to selecting my favorite group of ornamental grasses, my leaning would be towards Japanese forest grass, the Hakenakloa Macra. These are grasses that are native to Japan, and in terms of their hardiness, grow from a zone 5 to a zone 9, and they're often recommended for a partially shaded location. Now, I myself have grown them successfully further up north where I am in more sun, but I grow them in a heavier soil with a little bit more moisture. You do need to be careful in the hot, cooking summer heat and dry soils. They can crisp up, so that's where they're recommended for a more partially shaded location. In the trade, there are a number of cultivars that have been released with different types of foliage. Some have green and white foliage or green and gold, for example, Hakenakloa Macra aureola. Another selection, Hakenakloa Macra all gold, has solid gold foliage. Truly a stunning plant. And my favorite is actually just the straight species, which has the green foliage. Now, the plants themselves, again, are not very tall, and they have this arching habit and kind of are reminiscent of flowing water, kind of grow in kind of one direction and look like flowing water, which is really quite neat. I love the motion that they provide as they constantly sway. They do flower, these little sprays of flower, which I think are very lovely, but they're not used for their showy blossoms as they are used for their wonderful foliage, which makes an amazing contrast against large leaf perennials. For example, things like Rodgersias or hostas. There's a wonderful textural contrast to them. I also love to use them in container arrangements. They just provide a neat flow, a neat filler, or even cascading component. I've used them in window boxes and hanging baskets, and people are often confused and not sure what they are because they don't recognize the plant out of the shaded location where they're used to see it. Another point that I would recommend and that I like to highlight about this plant is I love the fall presence that they provide, dancing in the wind. And for us here in the winter, they turn a beautiful tan color. And providing we don't get a deep dumping of snow, they remain upright and continue to dance all winter. Japanese forest grass are really quite diverse in terms of the selections that are available and in terms of how they can be used in the garden. But truly my favorite of all of the ornamental grasses. Again, a hard choice to make, but really quite exceptional. I'd like to thank the folks of Fine Gardening for the opportunity to be involved in this podcast, and I wish you all the very best in all your gardening adventures.
So I loved that Paul talked about Blackhawks Big Bluestem. I have that one.
I have that one too. Much to the chagrin of my husband, who's a Boston Bruins fan, and the arch nemesis is the Blackhawks from Chicago. So, every time I feel like I got to keep an eye on that plant because I feel like my husband's going to dig it out when I'm not looking.
Does he even know its name, though?
He does!
Oh, no.
He does.
Bad news.